The 16-bit era, just in general, was a golden age for shooters. No matter which console you owned, the TurboGrafx, the Super Nintendo, the Genesis, or even if you were one of the lucky few to own a Neo Geo, if you wanted some stellar shooting action, regardless of your screen orientation, chances are you weren't going to have to look hard to find a game that suited your needs. Lords of Thunder, Axlay, Lightning Force, Last Resort, a lot of L's there, come to think of it. But regardless of alliteration, you could pretty much throw a dart with your eyes closed in an electronics boutique around 93 to 95 and probably hit a good shooter somewhere on the shelves. If you were a publisher at the time, you pretty much had two trains of thought. Either you were going to lean towards a different genre because you didn't want to deal with all of the competition, or, well, if you can't beat them, then join them, right? And, well, what better way for an unlicensed publisher to try to make a sale than produce a game that kinda sorta looks like one of those other amazing shooters, possibly pulling a fast one on an otherwise unsuspecting clueless kid, or their equally clueless parent. However, I should probably pause for a second because I'm sure that there's some of you out there that don't know me and just randomly got dropped here due to searching for a much more well-known game series that actually predates Earth Defense by a few years and just has an unfortunate similar title. Titles. Hi, my name is Dave and welcome to Zilog and Moto, the channel where I'm out to collect and review not just video games that have a very questionable legal basis to exist, but also the nearly 1,280 other titles released in the English language for the Sega Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega or Mega CD as the case may be, and finally the 32X. Basically, if I can plug it into a Genesis either by itself or with some sort of add-on, and be able to read what's up on the screen, I'm trying to get a copy of it and review it for posterity, with both looks at that original packaging and gameplay captured from original hardware whenever possible. For today's review, we're looking at a vertical shooter from publisher Realtec. And keep in mind, that is Realtec with a C, not the crab-based semiconductor Realtek with a K. In the United States, Realtec released 4 games, supposedly, although whether the game Tom Clown was actually released separately on a cartridge or only bundled in ROM format with their Magicom game copying device is somewhat questionable. I've certainly never seen a copy of it that wasn't just a render of what it should theoretically look like anyway. Aside from Tom Clown, that leaves the amazing titles, note the sarcasm there, like Funny World and Balloon Boy and Mallet Legends Whack-A-Critter, along with today's game, Earth Defense. Or is it the Earth Defend? Confused? You won't be in a minute when we get to the inside of the packaging. Of all those games listed, Earth Defense, at least from the outside, seems like clearly the best game of the bunch, which makes sense considering that it was the last game that Realtec released, with it coming 2 years after all of those other titles in 1995. And I've just got to wonder, why? I mean, it was already nearly impossible to buy unlicensed carts in the United States as major chains wouldn't touch them for fear of angering Sega, and now you're going to release a game after the 32-bit era had begun on top of it? Earth Defense would have had to have been really a pretty special bit of programming to make any kind of sense at all with that working against it, and I've got to be honest, I've got my doubts about that. But no judging books or games by their covers, so let's actually boot this game up and see what it's all about. But first, a look at the package.
And this is my copy of Earth Defense for the Genesis. Yep, that's it, in all its shining glory. Can you believe this isn't a licensed game? I mean, it looks like crap. It's actually not in bad condition considering, with the case being more or less fully intact, minus the hang tab at the top. And yes, I checked my other Realtec games, these cases were supposed to have a hang tab, just in case you're looking to add any of them to your collection. And God help you if that's the case. Having said that, none of the Realtec games are terribly valuable, with Earth Defense currently going for between $20 to $25 on price charting, and I think that price is held, as I picked this one up within the last few years and paid $20 for it, I'm pretty certain. As far as the front cover goes, well, I mean, what can you really say about this? Realtec tried to mirror the look of the licensed Genesis games at the time by having the red stripes on the spine of the package, so I guess that's somewhat clever. But of course, there's no Sega seal of approval being unlicensed, and the only mention of the Sega Genesis is almost blocked out by the art at the bottom in an interesting design choice. The art as a whole definitely makes this look like an amateur product, but we've seen plenty of lousy covers on the channel over the last 229 episodes, and certainly this isn't the worst of the lot. Yeah, I get a real high school art class feel to this one. Not that there's anything wrong with that, it's certainly a lot better than anything I would have come up on my own. It's just how it feels. Like perhaps this is something that a kid might have sketched out while bored between biology and AP English. I think that perhaps the Taiwanese version might have gotten different art, as seen on the front of the manual, but I'm not aware of any pictures of that version to compare, and even if it did get that version of the art, I don't know that it's necessarily an improvement, it's just different. Flipping over the back, and there's not a ton here, although to be fair, I really wasn't expecting much either. I do like the tagline at the top though, with "Only you can come to the Earth's defense," echoing those old Uncle Sam recruitment posters with the emphasis on that "you." Or perhaps Smokey the Bear. I mean, who can say? I've got to say, at least the English in the various bullet points is written well. No typos or English that we'd sometimes see. And they hit pretty much all of the high points that you would expect to see in a shooter. 1 or 2 players, 5 levels, talking up the bosses and weapons, and of course giving your ship a special name, which is apparently the Phoenix Spitfire. And again, not a bad name, seems like a theme here that potentially more work and care went in here than probably it gets credit for. Likewise, the screenshots aren't bad as well, if maybe a bit dark and oddly cropped. Opening up the non-standard clamshell, and along with the very brief manual, which is actually more of a pamphlet, and the unique shaped cartridge, it looks like we got a business card for a long-defunct reseller in FND Collectibles. I did not get this game from them, so who knows how old this card is. As far as that manual goes, when you unfold it, on one side, there's again a well-written synopsis of the game's storyline, and if you flip over to the back, there's some quick instructions about what buttons do what, and then some nice art showing off the various enemies in the game and some of the bosses, with a few extra screenshots at the end. It may seem a bit cheap, and unfortunately it's too tall to properly fit inside the case for some odd reason, but there is one thing going for it, and that's it's all in color, as opposed to the traditional Genesis manuals which are always in just black and white. So chalk up 1 there for the unlicensed title. Okay, that's the slightly unusual package. Let's get to the game and see if Realtec and developer AV Artisan possibly overachieved here with the game itself, or if it's exactly what I'm expecting, an average, middle-of-the-road shooter. You ever play a game that, if it had been released at another time, it might have been pretty good, but then when you compare it to other games that were on the market that year, it comes up a bit short? I think that's the lasting impression that I got from Earth Defense, and in all honesty, when you compare that to other games that were released by Realtec on the Genesis, that's actually a lot more positive than I was expecting. Or at least I'm assuming so anyway. I haven't actually played Whack-A-Critter or Funny World and Balloon Boy. I'm just going on their general reputation. The whole point is, when I went into Earth Defense, I had no idea what to expect. I've played some not-so-great shooters over the years that were properly licensed and came from developers that you've actually heard of, so it's not like it's a genre of game that's easy to make a decent game out of, even if you know what you're doing. So to now put that responsibility on a developer that had never made a shooter before, well, it's a recipe for disaster to be quite frank. And to be clear, just because a software publisher isn't properly licensed, I don't think that necessarily means that they're going to produce a bad game. Accolade released plenty of titles on the Genesis before they came on board with Sega and became a licensed publisher, and there are certainly some quality in that library of games. However, just the nature of being unlicensed opens the doors to the possibility that perhaps they didn't mind cutting a corner or two to release a game, resulting in titles that might have some questionable legality, amongst other things. And if they're going to cut corners to get the game on the market, you have to ask yourself, what else are they going to possibly do or not do to sell their game? A good example of this is in the game Water Margin that we covered on the channel back in episode 135. Water Margin is a solid beat 'em up, but if you're familiar with the genre, you can tell after playing it for a bit that there's some assets in the game that were stolen from other, more famous beat 'em ups. And knowing that parts of the game are ripped off from other places does hurt the legitimacy of the title. So having said all that, was Realtec going to deliver an Accolade type experience with Earth Defense, or was it going to be more of a situation like Water Margin, where the game probably shouldn't exist outside of Taiwan, if there? Well, the only way to find that out was to boot it up and look for myself, so I did, and immediately had problems. When Earth Defense boots up, rather than seeing the blue Sega screen that you're probably used to, what you're supposed to see is a red Realtec logo in big block letters, and I did, repeatedly, as all I saw was the logo flashing every few seconds. Well, it turns out that due to some sort of custom programming that AV Artisan, the developer of these Realtec titles, did, the game will not boot up if you have a 32X plugged into the console. No big deal, and when I plugged the game into a Genesis Sans 32X, it booted up as you normally would expect. I don't have a Genesis Model 3 to test with, and honestly I don't want one, but I've also read that apparently Realtec games don't function on those either. So you might want to keep that in mind if you're trying to play this game on anything other than a stock Model 1 or Model 2. Once I was actually able to get into the game, I was greeted by an interesting green schematic of your plane, and then a cutscene of the plane thrusting forward and eventually taking off to appear in the title screen, which features both the Chinese and English titles. Kind of. The Chinese apparently translates to Earth Defense War, according to Google Lens. And then there's the version of the title from the manual, the Earth Defend, instead of Earth Defense. I'm not exactly sure what happened here. Maybe the people at Realtec that were responsible for the box art thought that the Earth Defend didn't sound like proper English, and to be fair, it doesn't. So they just took it upon themselves to alter the name. Honestly, that original translation, Earth Defense War, is the coolest sounding of the three, so it's too bad they didn't just go with that. Once you get to the start menu, you have the option to either start 1 or 2 player mode, and then there's also a basic options screen, which allows you to adjust how many lives you start out with, the amount of continues, and then the difficulty level, with 2 selections of normal or hard. There's also a music text option, which is kind of nice if you want to sample the in-game music, because normally when you're playing the game, it tends to be a bit noisy with all the sound effects, so this option is somewhat necessary to hear a clean version of the soundtrack. More on the game's sound in a bit, but as far as the rest of the options go, I think they're solid, and it's always nice when a shooter allows you to potentially make the game a bit easier on you. Or more difficult if you're a psycho, I guess. The overall concept behind the game is one that's been used many times in shooters, and it's pretty plainly stated in the title Earth Defense. The manual gives a bit more exposition and states that the Earth has been invaded by aliens from another galaxy, and in response to the attack, the greatest scientists amongst the United Nations have banded together and secretly created a fighter jet called the Phoenix Spitfire, and you have been tasked with flying it to fight back against the alien hordes. Now, I'm not sure how this explanation applies to 2-player mode. Maybe the scientists were able to create 2 top-secret Phoenix Spitfires, but I probably shouldn't be trying to bring logic into a game whose plot somewhat mirrors the ending of Independence Day. Regardless, your mission has you attacking the aliens in 5 levels that each take place on a different continent, with Australia and Antarctica seemingly being spared by the invasion. As is pretty standard with shooters, the bulk of the levels is spent trying to survive the onslaught of various enemies and hopefully trying to collect power-ups before finally ending up in a showdown with the boss of the level, and then rinse and repeat until you've either used up all of your lives and continues, or been able to take down the last boss. As you can see on the screen, Earth Defense is a vertical shooter, and to its credit, it actually works pretty well in that regard. Previously, in games like Thunderblade or Space Invaders 91, I've been somewhat critical of vertical shooters on home consoles because of how the screen is oriented, with it being wider than it is tall, as opposed to how these games are in the arcades, where the screens are rotated to give more vertical real estate to play with. The issue that tends to come up is because there's a shorter distance between the top and bottom of the screen, usually you'll have less time to respond to oncoming enemies. Thankfully, Earth Defense handles this well, and almost always when I died, I felt like it was due to my own error rather than the game being cheap. Like most other shooters, your ship starts out with a standard attack that can, and as a rule, must be upgraded if you want to have a chance of beating the enemy. For instance, there's plenty of enemies in the game, especially the further you get into it, that are so tough that you won't be able to destroy them before they reach your ship, and it's in your best interest to simply avoid them and focus on the enemies that you can destroy if you happen to be underpowered. Thankfully, the game provides an automated rapid fire by pressing A, so no having to mess around with using a specific controller with a rapid fire option or anything like that. There are 3 power-ups that you can gain for your offense: a spread attack, a wave attack, and additional satellite ships that you can adjust their position by pressing B. At first, I had no idea what the B button did because the manual unfortunately doesn't do a good job of explaining it, and I didn't have the satellite power-up at the time, but eventually I figured it out, and while I didn't really utilize that option to move them around too much, it's nice to at least have it. The spread and the wave attack can both be powered up multiple times if you're able to collect multiples of them, and as you're probably not surprised to hear, it's very beneficial to have them powered up. However, it's not the end of the world if you die and lose your power-ups due to how special attacks are handled in the game. And I can hear you out there right now, oh, a giant bomb that clears the screen of enemies, right? How original. And no, that's actually not how the special attack works. Instead, it grants you temporarily invincibility, so even if you lose your power-ups, you can still get up in the enemies, and specifically bosses, grills, and really try to lay down some damage. Just due to the somewhat unique nature of this attack, and I say knowing this, I'm sure it probably has been done in some other games that I'm simply not aware of, I've got to give some points for originality here. Unfortunately, other than that, there's very little here that you haven't seen before or done other places, and probably better. I think a good comparison here might be Raiden, but just for some perspective, Raiden was released about 4 years before Earth Defense, and even with a 4-year head start, Earth Defense was still released in a pretty small cartridge, only weighing in at 4 megabits, whereas Raiden was an early 8 megabit release. And unfortunately, this has to count against the game, as I mentioned in the beginning of the review section. If it's not able to compete against a game that was released almost 4 years before it hit the market, that's a bit of a problem, regardless of how good of a game that Raiden or other similar titles are. From a graphics perspective, you can definitely tell the lack of size to the cartridge. The backgrounds used in each of the 5 levels don't look bad per se, but they are incredibly plain. Also, there's nothing going on with them, they just kind of scroll by as you make your way from point A to point B, with no animations anywhere, as if you're just flying over a really boring painting. There's no enemies or buildings on the ground to shoot, so it's literally just a background to give the level a feel related to what continent it's supposed to be taking place over, and that's it. The enemies are a bit better though, and while some of them repeat through the levels, I think they did a good job of having a separation between them, which helps give each of the levels an individual feel. As with most 2D shooters of the era, one of the graphical issues that tends to pop up relates to slowdown, with the game engine trying to keep up with all the sprites that are on the screen at one time. Earth Defense is no different, and you'll likely run into some slowdown issues during gameplay. For the most part, it doesn't affect the game, and in some cases it's actually helpful to have the action slow down, as it can make it easier to try to determine where you want to go to avoid getting hit. However, it should be mentioned that my experience with playing the game was in single-player mode, and while the slowdown was tolerable there, it's possible that it would be that much worse in 2-player mode, just due to the game having to keep up with that many more sprites, so just be aware of that if you want to try to play with a buddy. I was definitely more impressed with the music in the game than the graphics. The soundtrack to Earth Defense is solid, when you can hear it, anyway. This again is a common issue in shooters, with plenty of action taking place on screen, and with explosions and artillery fire going off almost constantly, it can get in the way of the music. But I do have to give credit where it's due, and considering the nature of the title, I was impressed that the music was as good as it was. However, there is a caveat here. Apparently, one of the reasons why the music is as good as it is because AV Artisan reportedly bootlegged Sunsoft's sound implementation from the Japanese exclusive Shikinjo. Now, is the average player that just wants to blow up things in a shooter going to know or care that AV Artisan ripped off a driver used in some random Mahjong-esque title that they'll most likely never know about? Probably not, and this is sort of the nature of the gray area of unlicensed titles, but it definitely doesn't help their case either. All in all, the best thing I can say about Earth Defense is that it definitely exceeded my expectations. Now, granted, my expectations for the game before playing it were more or less non-existent, so it wasn't exactly a high bar to cross, but it did get over. While the game is clearly what would have been considered a budget title at the time, it still does what it sets out to do, and that's provide a player with a solid, if not limited in some areas, vertical shooter, while eschewing traditional bomb attacks for invincibility, to give the game a sense of doing something different. As a result, I'm giving Earth Defense 2 stars, because while it doesn't specifically do anything wrong, in 1995, it simply wasn't doing enough, or anything that hadn't been done before.
Okay, and that's Earth Defense for the Genesis. If you happen to utilize Sega Retro on the internet, and you really should as it's a fantastic reference site for all of these titles, the description of Earth Defense's gameplay is that it's a, quote, fairly bog-standard shoot-'em-up, unquote, and that pretty much says it all. I think when viewed through a 2024 lens, a good analogy might be if you fed AI a bunch of vertical shooter information and told it to create a vertical shooter based on that, this might be what it would come up with, minus the odd bugs that I think we're used to at this point with AI art. Again, it's not a bad game, but with all of the better choices available on the Genesis, much less the TurboGrafx PC Engine or Super Nintendo, I'm just not sure why you'd play this unless you'd simply already played everything else. Next time on Zilog and Moto, it's sports time on the Genesis again, and it's a game that I'm positive won't get near the attention that NFL Sports Talk 93 got a few episodes ago, unfortunately. In fact, I'm pretty sure this one is going to fall on the somewhat obscure end of the spectrum, just because even as sports games go, this particular sport isn't exactly that popular when it comes to video games. Although, I've got to say, I've been playing Far Cry 5 recently, and this sport is included in that game, so I'll be somewhat curious if there's any comparison at all that can be made between the two, or if perhaps this one is just too classic to compare. And yes, I know that hint is a bit of a stretch, but I mean, come on, they can't all be winners. Well, that's it for Zilog and Moto episode 230. If you liked what you saw here and want to see more, please think about liking and subscribing if you are so inclined, as it will help more people see these videos. But most importantly, whatever you like to play, have fun and be excellent to each other. Later!